He was held for over 2 years, and now he's finally free.
Yeah.
We're diving straight into the story of George Glezmann.
An American tourist released from Taliban custody.
That's our mission today, to really try and understand what happened here.
This is more than just one man's freedom.
Right.
This touches on the complicated realities of international relations, when formal ties are absent.
Exactly. George Glezmann, he's a mechanic from Atlanta, Georgia, with Delta Airlines, and he took what was supposed to be just a quick 5-day trip to Afghanistan back in December 2022. And his goal was to immerse himself in the country's history and culture, to really understand the 2 years that followed, the path to his release, and the bigger picture.
Right.
We've got a range of news articles for this, laying out the timeline, the details of the release, and of course the crucial geopolitical backdrop.
And as we get into this, you'll see how just one individual's experience really sheds light on some complex international dynamics.
Absolutely. All right. So let's get into that timeline. December 5th, 2022, that's when George Glezmann was detained by the Taliban's intelligence service.
Okay.
And really important to note right away, he was never actually charged with any crime.
That immediately makes you wonder about why he was detained. Like, what was the Taliban's objective? Doesn't seem like it was a legal matter, at least not on the surface.
Not officially, right?
Right.
And the conditions that he reportedly endured, they were just awful. We're talking about a small cell, periods of solitary confinement, sometimes even underground for months at a time.
Wow.
There was even a resolution from Georgia senators outlining these conditions. He also suffered some pretty serious health issues, facial tumors, hypertension, and he was malnourished. And it really led to a significant decline in both his physical and mental health.
Those details really highlight the human cost of these kinds of situations.
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes it clear why securing the release of people like Mr. Glezmann is so critical.
Absolutely. Now, fast forward to January of this year, 2025. The Biden administration actually brokered a prisoner swap. 2 other Americans, Ryan Corbett and William Wallace McKenty. They were released in exchange for the U.S. releasing Khan Mohammed, a Taliban member who had been serving a life sentence here in the U.S.
Right.
But here's where it gets interesting. George Glezmann was not part of that exchange.
It makes you wonder, why weren't all of the detained Americans included in that swap? Were there just different factors at play in Mr. Glezmann's case?
Yeah, it's very strange. Then on March 20th, 2025, the news broke. George Glezmann was free.
Wow.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the release, and Glezmann was actually seen boarding a Qatari aircraft in Kabul.
Oh, wow.
With officials from both the U.S. and Qatar present.
The fact that there were Qatari officials there on the ground in Kabul, that really kind of points to their involvement and maybe something about how these negotiations went down.
Absolutely. And when we talk about the people who made this happen, there were several key individuals. We've got Secretary Rubio, of course. He announced the release, and he made sure to thank Qatar for their help.
Yeah.
Adam Bowler, who served as the Trump administration's special envoy for hostage affairs.
Right.
He played a major role in the negotiations, and he even accompanied Glezmann on that flight out of Afghanistan.
The fact that Mr. Bowler stayed involved, even though he wasn't in an official capacity,
Yeah.
I mean, that suggests there was a sustained effort to get Glezmann released. Maybe some relationships that proved to be crucial.
Definitely. And then there's Zalmay Khalilzad, the former special envoy for Afghanistan reconciliation.
During the first Trump administration.
Exactly. He participated in the meeting in Kabul, and he actually described Glezmann's release as a gesture of goodwill from the Taliban towards President Trump. So Mr. Khalilzad's statement gives us one way to look at the Taliban's decision, but obviously there could be other reasons too.
Right, of course.
Yeah. We also need to mention Amir Khan Muttaqi, the Taliban's foreign minister. He was at that meeting in Kabul too, and reports say that they talked about more than just Glezmann's release, things like bilateral relations and economic relations as well.
So it sounds like the release wasn't just some isolated event.
Yeah.
But that it happened in the context of some engagement, however limited it might be on other issues.
Exactly. And we can't overstate the role of Qatar here. They've been described as crucial and instrumental in making this release happen.
Yeah.
They were credited with a steadfast commitment and diplomatic efforts.
It seems like Qatar has become a major player in these really sensitive negotiations.
Right.
Using their unique relationships in the region.
Yeah.
Their constant involvement really highlights the trust they've built with different groups.
Absolutely. Now, that meeting in Kabul, that was a pretty big deal. It was reported as the first known in-person contact of any significance between the U.S. and the Taliban since President Trump took office.
In January 2025.
That's right. And what were the main topics, you ask?
I'm listening.
Well, Glezmann, of course, but also those broader bilateral relations. And according to the Taliban, the possibility of some positive economic relations.
It's amazing how the release of one person can lead to communication on bigger issues.
Yeah.
Even if it is a little tentative.
For sure. Finally, Glezmann arrived safely in Doha, Qatar, accompanied by Adam Bowler.
Good.
And then, of course, the next step is getting him home to the United States.
After such a long and difficult time, getting to Doha must have been a huge relief for him and his family.
Absolutely. So let's take a step back here and look at the big picture.
Okay.
Qatar's role is central.
Definitely.
They have these close ties with the Taliban.
Yeah.
And a history of hosting all kinds of diplomatic talks. So that really puts them in a unique position.
Right, as a critical intermediary.
Especially given that the U.S. and the Taliban don't have any direct diplomatic relations.
Exactly. It's like Qatar is this bridge.
Yeah.
Facilitating communication and negotiation because there just aren't any formal channels between Washington and Kabul.
Exactly. And this whole thing really highlights the state of U.S. Taliban relations right now.
Yeah.
On one hand, you could see this release as a potential, albeit tentative, step towards dialogue and maybe even normalization. And we've even seen some reports that say some people within the Taliban are actually interested in normalizing relations.
Even though the U.S. doesn't officially recognize them and still has sanctions in place.
That's right.
It's a really delicate balance to strike. I mean, there might be a desire on both sides for some kind of engagement, but the differences run so deep.
Yeah.
And without formal diplomatic structures, it's going to be slow going and very cautious.
It's true. And let's not forget, the U.S. doesn't even have an embassy in Kabul.
Right.
And those sanctions are still there. Plus, as Secretary Rubio pointed out, there is still other Americans detained in Afghanistan. 6 that we know of, and the remains of 1 U.S. citizen.
Wow.
The State Department says they're still working on getting them released, with the case of Mahmoud Shah Habibi, who's been detained since August 2022, being a top priority.
I did find it interesting that the U.S. government sometimes distinguishes between someone being wrongfully detained versus unjustly detained.
Yeah. What's that about?
Well, wrongfully detained often has a very specific legal meaning. It implies there wasn't due process or a legal basis for the detention under international law. And that can trigger certain actions from the U.S. government, make it a higher priority.
I see.
Unjustly detained, on the other hand, might be more about broader human rights concerns or political considerations.
Okay.
Even if the initial detention seemed legal under the detaining country's own laws.
I see.
And the fact that the U.S. doesn't have an embassy in Kabul, unlike some European countries, that probably makes it harder to gather information and advocate for these detainees.
Absolutely. Now we should touch on the political aspects of this, too. The fact that former Trump administration officials were involved.
Like Bowler and Klozov?
Exactly. And the statements thanking President Trump, all of that suggests there might be some domestic political considerations at play here.
Yeah. We're not going to offer any opinions on that, but it's definitely something that's been pointed out in the news coverage.
It's pretty common for international events like this.
Yeah.
Especially ones that involve getting American citizens released, to have some kind of political impact back home.
Right.
And to be presented in ways that appeal to different political groups.
For sure. Okay. Finally, let's talk about the Taliban's stated motivation for doing this.
Okay.
Zalmay Khalilzad said that this release was a goodwill gesture at PTS and the American people. Now, we obviously don't know what really went on in their discussions.
Right.
But that's the reason they gave publicly.
Whether that was the only reason?
Yeah.
Or if there were other strategic things they were thinking about?
Right.
Like trying to gain some favor or see if they can have a better relationship with the U.S. in the future?
Yeah.
Well, we can only guess.
We can only speculate, right?
But Mr. Khalilzad's statement, that's their official explanation. That's what they're saying, at least.
So, as you've listened to all of this, what are your thoughts? What stood out to you? If for me, it's the length and difficulty of George Glezmann's ordeal. The fact that Qatar was absolutely essential in getting him released. The really complicated and limited relationship between the U.S. and the Taliban. And, of course, the concern for the other Americans who are still being detained.
It really highlights the fact that international diplomacy has so many different sides. Personal stories, complex geopolitics, different actors all trying to figure things out.
Absolutely. Now, here's something for everyone listening to think about. Given that there are no formal diplomatic ties between the U.S. and the Taliban,
Right.
and considering all the conflict that's happened in the past,
Yeah.
and the different approaches taken by the Biden administration with that earlier swap,
Right.
and now the involvement of these former Trump officials, what do you think are the best long-term strategies for the U.S. to get its remaining citizens out of detention in Afghanistan?
And to figure out its future relationship with the Taliban, it's a really tough question.
It brings up some really important questions about how countries can protect their people when you don't have those traditional diplomatic relationships.
Yeah.
And how to interact with groups that have completely different ways of seeing the world and governing.
It's a huge challenge. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into such an important story.
Of course.
It really shows how important the human element is in international relations and the challenges of diplomacy, especially in places that have seen so much conflict.
And it reminds us that these situations often involve a whole web of different players,
Yeah.
each with their own agendas and motivations,
Right?
which makes finding a resolution incredibly complex.
Absolutely. We encourage you to keep thinking about the different factors we talked about today. Maybe even do some research into the history of U.S.-Afghanistan relations.
Yeah.
Or the role that third-party mediators play in these kinds of international situations. This situation is still developing, so we'll likely see more news about the other detained Americans in the future.
I'm sure we will.
Thanks again for listening.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.